December 21st, 1944. Malmedy, Belgium. Before dawn. 6 American soldiers are lost. Not metaphorically lost. Physically, geographically, operationally lost. Cut off from their unit in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, surrounded by fog and frozen ground, and a German armored advance that Army intelligence had assured them was impossible in this terrain. They are between the ages of 19 and 21. The oldest is barely old enough to buy a drink in peacetime. The youngest, the one who is about to make every decision that keeps them alive, is 19 years old, 6 feet tall, and weighs 130 pounds. His name is Francis Curry. 6 weeks ago, he was a replacement soldier who arrived at the front without winter gear and immediately got frostbite. The Army evaluated him for officer candidate school, found him talented enough to complete the program, and then decided not to commission him. Their reason? Too immature. Out of the fog, a German armored column rolls toward them. Captured American tanks at the front, German infantry behind them, the whole formation moving with the confidence of forces that know they have the numbers and the steel and the surprise. Curry looks at what is coming. He looks at the 6 men beside him. He looks at the abandoned factory on the corner, the half-track sitting in the street, the buildings full of Germans, and the road with no friendly forces anywhere between here and the horizon. He starts making decisions. By the end of that single day, December 21st, 1944, one day in 9 months of combat, Francis Curry will have disabled 4 enemy tanks, cleared a building full of German soldiers, crossed an open street under direct fire twice, rescued 5 men pinned down for hours, and guided 11 survivors back to American lines on an abandoned Jeep with a machine gun mounted on the spare wheel. The Army said he was too immature to lead. He said, "I knew what I was doing." Francis Sherman Curry was born on June 29, 1925, in Loch Sheldrake, New York, a small resort community in the Catskill Mountains of Sullivan County, the kind of place that existed in a particular American register of modest rural life, far from the cities and the factories and the noise of the industrializing East Coast. He was orphaned at 12. The specifics of how he came to be without parents are not widely documented. What is documented is the outcome. He was taken in by foster parents who worked a farm in Hurleyville, a few miles from where he was born. He grew up working the land, doing the physical labor that farm life demands regardless of age or circumstance, learning the specific patience and practicality that comes from work that doesn't pause for feelings. He was a quiet kid, studious enough, tall for his age. He would reach 6 feet before the Army got him, but so lean that the height was almost comic, a frame that hadn't yet found the weight to fill it. 130 pounds stretched across 6 feet of ambition. He had a plan for his life that had nothing to do with the military. During high school, he worked for a local embalmer. He was good at it. He was calm around death in the way that some people simply are, not because they don't feel it, but because they have a practical relationship with it, an understanding that the work in front of you needs to be done, regardless of how you feel about what it involves. He planned to qualify as a mortician. He had a clear path, a marketable skill, a future that made sense. 1 week after graduating from high school in 1943, he walked into an Army recruiting office and enlisted. The war had changed the calculus for a generation of young men who had grown up watching the news from Europe and the Pacific and understood, with the specific clarity that comes from paying attention, that what was happening was going to determine the shape of everything that came after. Curry was 18. He was old enough to understand the stakes and young enough to believe that the right response to understanding them was to go. The Army processed him, trained him, and sent him to officer candidate school. He completed the program. His instructors noted his ability, his technical competence, his capacity to absorb training and apply it under pressure. Then they reviewed his file and made their determination. Too immature for a commission. He was 18 years old. The decision was not entirely unreasonable on its face. 18 is young, and the Army had learned across years of combat that the gap between technical competence and the emotional steadiness required to command men in contact was not always bridged by training alone. They were trying to protect soldiers from officers who weren't ready. They sent him to the front as a private instead. There was a further complication. President Roosevelt had issued an executive order in the wake of the Sullivan Brothers disaster. 5 brothers from Iowa, all serving on the same ship, all killed when it was sunk in 1942, preventing servicemen from being deployed abroad until they reached the age of 19. Curry's birthday was June 29th. He had to wait until the end of June 1944 to ship out. He used the time to train. He learned everything the Army would teach him. He learned to fire the bazooka, the M1A1 rocket launcher that was the infantry's primary anti-tank weapon, with the kind of proficiency that comes from genuine engagement with a technical problem, rather than the minimum competency required to pass a qualification. He also learned to use the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR, a 20-pound automatic weapon that fired the same .30 caliber cartridge as the standard M1 Garand, but at a rate that gave a single soldier the suppressive fire capability of a small fire team. It was a weapon that rewarded physical strength and technical mastery in equal proportion, and Curry had developed both. He arrived in France as a replacement in the autumn of 1944. Replacements were the Army's solution to the attrition problem. Individual soldiers fed into depleted units to bring them back to strength. Men who arrived without the unit cohesion and shared experience that made veteran outfits function. It was a system that worked statistically and was brutal personally. You arrived at a frontline unit not knowing anyone, in the middle of a war that had already killed the men whose places you were taking. He arrived without winter gear. The autumn of 1944 in Belgium and Luxembourg was cold in the way that the Catskill Mountains are cold. Not exotic, not dramatically extreme, but the persistent, penetrating cold of elevation and damp that settles into bones and doesn't leave. Curry got frostbite almost immediately. He treated it and kept going. 6 weeks after his first combat action, the Army had made him a sergeant and a platoon leader. The institution that had decided he was too immature to be commissioned as an officer had, in the specific, pragmatic logic of a war that was consuming leadership faster than it could be produced, placed him in charge of a platoon anyway. He was 19 years old, 6 feet tall, 130 pounds, a foster kid from a Catskill Mountain farm who had planned to be a mortician and ended up leading an infantry platoon in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive, Operation Watch on the Rhine, the largest German attack on the Western Front since 1940, had begun on December 16, 1944. 20 German divisions with over 1,000 tanks had punched through the American lines in the Ardennes, exploiting a section of the front that Allied command had judged too heavily forested and too difficult for major armored operations. Allied command was wrong. By December 21st, the situation across the Ardennes was a controlled crisis. Some units holding, some units destroyed, the overall line bending but not yet broken. And in the fog and confusion of a winter offensive through forested hills, hundreds of small groups of Americans cut off from their units trying to find their way back to friendly lines or hold their ground until relief came. On the road outside Malmedy, Francis Curry and 5 other soldiers were about to find out what the main German armored thrust actually looked like from ground level. Up close. The German column came out of the fog like something from a nightmare. captured American tanks at the front, M4 Shermans, repainted with German markings, rolling forward with the particular confidence of armor that knows the infantry in front of it has nothing that can stop it. Behind them, German infantry in their winter white. Behind them, more armor. The whole formation moving on the main road to Frankischer, which was also the road that Curry and his 5 companions were standing on. Army intelligence had told them German armor could not operate effectively in this area. The terrain, the roads, the conditions. The analysis said armored operations here were not viable. Curry would later observe, in the dry tone of a man who had earned the right to his opinions, "I always considered Army intelligence an oxymoron." The column overran the American anti-tank unit that had been positioned to cover the road. The 6 Americans scattered. They ended up in an abandoned factory on the corner of the road, a building with walls thick enough to provide some protection and enough interior space to move without being immediately visible through the windows. They had rifles. They had grenades. They had the particular resourcefulness of men who have been in combat long enough to understand that what you have and what you find are the same category of resource. Curry took stock. There was a bazooka in the factory. He was the only one in the group who knew how to use it. There was, however, no ammunition for it. The rockets that the launcher required to be anything more than a metal tube were not in the building. He looked out the window. Across the street, a street that was now covered by German positions, a street that any rational assessment of the situation would describe as impassable. There was an abandoned American half-track. And in the half-track, visible from the factory window, were bazooka rockets. He went to get them. Under direct fire from German infantry who had seen movement in the factory windows, Curry crossed the street. He reached the half-track, grabbed the rockets, and came back. He loaded the bazooka. The first tank he engaged was close. Close in the specific way that makes the physics of anti-tank weapons either adequate or inadequate, where the angle of impact and the thickness of armor are in a relationship that only resolves correctly if you have positioned yourself at exactly the right point. Curry had the training. He understood the geometry. He fired. The rocket hit the exact junction where the turret met the chassis, the point of maximum vulnerability, the seam in the armor that the weapons designers had intended as the target and that the weapons users often missed under the stress of combat. He did not miss. The tank stopped. He kept going. He found a supply of anti-tank grenades in the factory. Weapons that were not powerful enough to penetrate tank armor directly, but that produced a dramatic combination of smoke and concussive noise when they detonated. He began firing them at the remaining German armor. The effect was not what the grenades were designed to produce. It was better. The tank crews, hearing multiple detonations from different directions, with smoke obscuring their vision and no clear intelligence about what they were facing, made the decision that tank crews make when the tactical picture is unclear and the risk of a catastrophic hit is real. They abandoned their vehicles. Curry watched German tankers climb out of machines that his grenades could not actually destroy and run for cover. He had created, with noise and smoke and the specific psychology of men inside metal boxes who cannot see what is shooting at them, the impression of a much larger and more heavily armed force than 6 lost Americans in an abandoned factory. He was not finished. 5 American soldiers were pinned down in a building nearby, caught in the open when the column rolled through, unable to move without exposing themselves to the German infantry positions that had established control of the street. They had been there for hours. Without intervention, they would remain there, and the options available to pinned soldiers as a battle evolves around them are not good ones. Curry moved to get them out. He crossed the open ground, again under fire, again in the direct view of German positions that had every reason to shoot at anything moving, and reached the building where the 5 men were sheltering. He assessed the German positions between them and the route out. He identified the machine gun that was the primary obstacle. He went and found a dead German cruise machine gun. He set it up. He opened fire on the German positions from an angle that suppressed the guns covering the route the 5 pinned soldiers needed to use. Under his covering fire, they moved. All 5 of them, out of the building they had been trapped in for hours, moving through ground that had been impassable minutes before. He had crossed open ground under fire twice, destroyed or disabled 4 enemy armored vehicles, cleared a building, rescued 5 pinned soldiers, and was now in possession of a captured German machine gun in the middle of a street in Malmedy. The day was not over. There were wounded men who needed to get back to American lines. There were men on their feet who needed to navigate back through territory that the German advance had turned into a fluid, dangerous confusion of positions and patrols and fog. They found an abandoned American Jeep. It had stretcher mounts, designed for medical evacuation, capable of carrying wounded men horizontally. They loaded the most seriously injured soldiers onto the stretchers. The others climbed in. Curry mounted a Browning automatic rifle on the spare wheel at the back of the Jeep. He perched on the wheel behind it. They drove back toward American lines through the fog and the cold and the battlefield confusion of December 21st, 1944, with Curry riding on the spare wheel of a Jeep with a BAR, watching the darkness for movement, the last man between 11 survivors and whatever the road might offer. They made it back, all 11 of them. When the after-action accounts of December 21st were assembled, the picture they painted was specific and detailed in the way that eyewitness testimony from men who know what they are looking at tends to be specific and detailed. 4 enemy armored vehicles disabled or destroyed. A building cleared. 5 men rescued from a position they had been unable to escape for hours. 11 soldiers, including 2 seriously wounded, guided back to American lines under fire. 1 19-year-old. 1 day. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor moved up the chain. Curry found out he was receiving it the way he found out about most official Army communications regarding himself. Not from the Army. A friend had seen a clipping from his hometown newspaper, which had somehow received word of the award before the Army had gotten around to officially informing the recipient. He read about his own Medal of Honor in a newspaper story someone mailed him. He received it from President Truman in 1945. Belgium awarded him their equivalent of the Medal of Honor, the Chevalier de l'Ordre de Léopold II. The kingdom's recognition that what had happened on that road on December 21st had mattered not just to the American soldiers involved, but to the country that the soldiers had been fighting across. The New York Times ran an account that described, in the compressed language of wartime journalism, how he had helped immobilize 3 German tanks, wiped out a building full of German soldiers, rescued 6 trapped men, and guided 5 wounded soldiers back to safety. When people later asked Curry about December 21st, his answers were consistent in their refusal of mythology. About the Army's decision that he was too immature to lead, he said, "We were all teenagers. The oldest one was maybe 21 years old, and I was the one with all the training. I knew what I was doing." That sentence deserves its own examination. Not anger at the institution that had evaluated him and found him wanting. Not self-congratulation at having proved them wrong. Just a clear-eyed statement of fact. He had the training, he used it, and the outcome reflected that. About the day itself, he said, "I always considered Army intelligence an oxymoron. The armor wasn't supposed to be there. It was there." About the broader experience of 9 months in combat, of which December 21st was 1 day, he said something that provides the necessary context for everything else. The average lifespan of an infantry rifleman in combat, he noted, was 10 days. A platoon leader, even less. He had survived 9 months. December 21st was remarkable because of what he had done, but it was not remarkable in the sense of being unusual and kind. It was one day in a long sequence of days that each carried their own weight of decision and consequence and chance. Consider what the Battle of the Bulge was actually trying to accomplish. Hitler's plan, Operation Watch on the Rhine, was to split the Allied line, recapture the port of Antwerp, and cut off the British and Canadian forces in the north from their American allies in the south. If it succeeded, the Allies would be forced to negotiate. The unconditional surrender policy that Roosevelt and Churchill had committed to would become unsustainable. The war in the West might end on terms favorable enough to Germany to allow it to redirect resources to the Eastern Front. It was an enormous gamble on the part of a regime that had already lost the war in every meaningful strategic sense and was trying to find a single tactical masterstroke that would change the equation. The gamble failed, not because of any single action or any single soldier. Wars of this scale are not decided by individual moments in abandoned factories, but because of the accumulated resistance of thousands of units and hundreds of thousands of men who absorbed the German offensive and held their ground long enough for the Allied response to arrive. Curry and his 5 companions on the road to Francorchamps were one node in that resistance. One abandoned factory, one lost group of teenagers, one 19-year-old who had been told he was too immature to lead and had spent the intervening months accumulating evidence to the contrary. The German column that rolled out of the fog that morning expected to move through. It did not move through. One reason was the boy from the Catskills on his first deployment, who knew how to use a bazooka and understood the psychology of tank crews who couldn't see what was shooting at them. He was too immature to be an officer. He was not too immature for December 21st, 1944.
Francis Curry came home from the war and spent 30 years as a counselor at the VA Medical Center in Albany, New York. He worked a landscaping business. He worked at a hotel in Myrtle Beach. He lived a quiet life in the way that men of his generation who had seen what he had seen tended to live, without needing to perform the experience for anyone, without looking for occasions to revisit it, carrying it the way you carry something heavy for long enough that the weight becomes part of your normal. In 1998, Hasbro modeled the first ever Medal of Honor G.I. Joe action figure after him. A plastic soldier, 6 inches tall, wearing the uniform of the 82nd Airborne, sold in toy stores across America. Somewhere between the Catskill Mountain Farm and the Myrtle Beach Hotel, Francis Curry became a toy. He died on October 8, 2019. He was 94 years old. At the time of his death, he was one of the last 3 surviving recipients of the Medal of Honor from the Second World War. Think about the specific arithmetic of that fact. Of the more than 400 men awarded the Medal of Honor for service in the Second World War, 3 were still alive in 2019. Curry was one of them. A foster kid from Hurleyville who had planned to be a mortician, who had been told he was too immature for a commission, who had arrived at the front without winter gear and gotten frostbite in his first weeks. On December 21, 1944, he crossed an open street under fire to get bazooka ammunition from a half-track. He crossed it again to rescue 5 pinned soldiers. He found a dead crew's machine gun and used it to cover their escape. He loaded wounded men onto Jeep stretchers and rode the spare wheel back to American mines with a BAR, watching the dark. He did all of that at 19 years old on a road in Belgium where the armor wasn't supposed to be. He said he knew what he was doing. He was right. The army that called him too immature gave him the Medal of Honor. He accepted it, went home, and spent 30 years helping other veterans at the VA. That's the whole measure of the man.